1956, Elvis Presley revolutionizes rock and roll. It looked like nothing could slow him down. But something did. Drafted at the peak of his success, Presley is inducted into the Army on March 24th, 1958. He does his basic training at Fort Hood in Texas. Later, he serves the 3rd Armored Division in Germany as a truck driver. While in the Army in 1958, Elvis Presley will earn nearly $2 million. Otherwise, he will be just like any other soldier. Almost.
We heard the rumor that Elvis was coming to our base. So one night I was working late in the office with my friend George DiDomizio and my partner. I was a finance clerk for the Army. I lucked out. And we see all these people starting to gather up around outside the gates of the camp. And I asked George, what's going on? He says, well, we heard Elvis is coming to our base tonight. And all of a sudden, about 8 o'clock at night, buses come in with all these troops, and kids are screaming, yelling. Elvis was on the bus somewhere. You couldn't see him because everybody's dressed in GIs, and it was dark at night, but they all stood out there for hours and hours and screamed and yelled.
According to all regulations and the uniform code of military justice. The uniform code of military justice.
Elvis's life was not typical GI. There was always people outside of his house. The fans were always out there. It was a little tougher for him to be in the Army because everybody was watching him. And they were keeping an eye and make sure he did a good job and make sure he didn't goof off. So it was tougher for him than a lot of the other GIs.
How the Army would stand the impact of Mr. Presley was a big question months ago, but not now, as Elvis explained.
Elvis, since you've been in the Army, have the boys given you kind of a rough time in the barracks because of your past careers? No, sir, I was very surprised. I've never met a better group of boys in my life. They probably would have if it'd been like everybody thought. I mean, everybody thought I wouldn't have to work and I would be given special treatment and this and that. But when they looked around and saw I was on KP and I was pulling guard and everything just like they were, well, they figured, well, it's just like us.
When he's demobbed, Elvis hopes to develop his talent as a movie actor. Meanwhile, it's the Army for Elvis the Pelvis.
Basic training wasn't hard for me at all. It was harder afterwards, after I had gotten into a regular outfit. Not the service itself, but just the surroundings, and I was in a strange land, and the outfit I was in, they had quite a bit of field duty. We stayed in the field 6 months out of the year. And it was cold in Germany. It snowed quite a bit. And it was pretty hard to adjust to.
Elvis liked to have his friends and buddies around him. He enjoyed their company, and it made him comfortable, and he was basically a very shy person until he got to know you. So once he got comfortable around you, he'd rather have those people around him instead of strangers. First time he met Priscilla, I happened to be at the house that evening when she was introduced to him. When she walked in the door, I mean, very pretty young lady, but I didn't know how old she was at the time. And I figured she was about 16, but at the time she was 14, I find out later.
She liked young girls. She thought if they got 18, they were ready for Social Security. I said, listen, you better get some keys. And he said, what do we need keys for? I said, the fucking jail cell. They're going to put our ass in for you dating a 14-year-old girl. We ain't going to be able to
I'll tell you where part of that came from.
What?
Why Frank Freeman? He was 70, 80 years old.
Yeah.
And we used to notice that he would walk the studio with this beautiful young girl. They were probably starlit. So Dr. Blank at MGM Studios, who was the studio doctor, and he asked him, he says, I see Mr. Freeman, with all these young girls. He said, he's 70, 80 years old. He said, what can you do with these girls? And Dr. Blank looked at him and he said, Elvis, when you get Mr. Freeman's age, he said, come see me.
But she was very mature, very quiet at first, because naturally walked in the room with all these guys in there. And then Elvis, that's a pretty tough situation to be in.
Elvis, there have been a lot of rumors about your love life. Did you meet anyone special in Germany?
There was a little girl that I was seeing quite often over there that her father was in the Air Force, and Actually, they only got over there about 2 months before I left. I was seeing her, and she was at the airport when I left. And there were some pictures made of her. The stories came out, the girl he left behind. And all that. It wasn't like that. I mean, I had to be careful when I answer questions.
An international crowd of reporters and photographers from all major news outlets in Germany arrived at Ray Barrick's Friedberg for a special press conference. The most famous enlisted man and usurer during the last year and a half is about to go back to his millions of fans.
So it was farewell to military glory and the 16-year-old Priscilla. What fame for that girl to have been a friend of the Emperor of Rock and Roll.
Because he has been almost completely away from singing and acting while in the Army, reporters have plenty of questions about the future to ask Sergeant Elvis Presley. Elvis says he plans to continue with his style of rock and roll singing, but without his famous sideburns. However, his greatest interest is now in serious dramatic acting.
He's on the package there. Oh, telegram I got. Look at him, Nancy. Turn around, Elvis. Wait, turn around.
Have 2 years of sobering Army life changed your mind about rock and roll? Sobering Army life. No, it hasn't. It hasn't changed my mind because I was in tanks for a long time, you see. And they rock and roll quite a bit.
Can you give us in detail some of your future plans?
Well, the first thing I have to do is to cut some records. And then after that, I have a television show with Frank Sinatra. It's very nice to go traveling, but it's so nice to be here in person.
I may pass out.
Well, I did. Where the heck are his sideburns?
Well, I'll be a hound dog. And that's the opening, friend.